Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We are continuing the coverage, the analysis on the Sarah Everard case. As some of you may be aware, a second post-mortem has been carried out on Sarah Everard's body because the first one turned out inconclusive. We still don't know what the results of that have been. I think they have deferred to the ongoing criminal investigation. So there are two elements I want to highlight in this episode. This will be quite a short episode. And first of all, it is something that was again sent to me by someone on Patreon. It has to do with a friend of Sarah's. Her name's Helena Edwards. She studied at Durham University with Sarah. And just her take on the whole thing that has been happening around Sarah Everard. And this is what she says. This lady, Helena Edwards, she actually boycotted the vigil. Now this is a friend of Sarah's, right? She boycotted the vigil on Clapham Common, and she said the following as a reason why. She said, "My reason for not attending is this. My friend's tragic death has been hijacked. It is not a tribute to her anymore. It's about something else, and I don't like what it has become. Sarah is a victim of one of the most horrific crimes imaginable. She was extremely unlucky. That's all there is to it. Her abduction and murder is not, in my opinion, a symptom of a sexist, dangerous society." End quote. And I have to say I agree with probably most of what she says there. I agree that she was extremely unlucky, and I agree that her abduction isn't the symptom of a sexist society. It might be the symptom of a sexist individual. It might be the symptom of a dangerous individual, but a sexist and dangerous individual does not make a sexist and dangerous society. Of course, you could argue that a individual like that might come about as a result of certain elements like that. But it would be definitely difficult to convince me, certainly, of that point. Something else that I think is worth noting is on Sky News on the 17th of March, they did a poll or a survey, and they found that more than half of the people supported the Met Police's handling of the event, of the vigil. And I've got to say, in that respect as well, that it kind of beggars belief. Have people forgotten that there is a pandemic going on? Or are those people who are protesting part of those who believe that this is still a hoax so many months later? Or is it just really a case of, I don't really want to participate in a pandemic? And then you come back to that statement about a dangerous society. I think we are quite a dangerous society if we don't care about one another, meaning when you need to stay at home, and staying at home is for the benefit of society, right? Benefit of probably not necessarily you. You staying at home is not necessarily for your benefit, but it might be for somebody else's benefit, right? If you look at the coronavirus figures right now, the worldwide stats show another increased trend, and you are definitely not going to be able to constrain a pandemic by having protests all the time. In other words, in short, having large groups of people congregating together, no matter what the issue is, that's just not going to be helpful, and that is what the police clamp down on, essentially. If you look at the coronavirus dashboard for Johns Hopkins University, it looks like we're in a fourth wave spike, and there's just been a very big jump. I think it's now over 500,000 infections a day, right? And part of the reason for that is spikes in Brazil, where the infections are at an all-time high. So all-time, you've never had daily infections higher than they are now, at over 80,000 per day over 24 hours. In India, they bounced back to approximately 40,000, which is about half, maybe a little bit less than half of their maximum level. And in the United Kingdom, you have the number stabilizing, but at around about probably 8,000 or so, which is still above the first wave. I think a lot of people are ready for this pandemic to be over, but unfortunately it doesn't work like that. You don't say, well, I'm tired of it, so let's hope it's past. You know, if you imagine you have cancer and you say, I'm tired of the chemotherapy, I'm tired of feeling like this, the cancer doesn't listen to it and say, oh, okay, well, it'll be over then. And now I want to raise the point of something that came up in an article on NBC News. I think it's the publication is called Think, and it's about opinion, analysis, and essays. It makes you think that the analysis here, it will be quite intelligent. And this is the quote from this particular article. The article is titled, "The Sarah Everard case shows society's rules for women don't matter if men intend to harm us." And then just an excerpt from the article, quote, "There's been much debate about the rarity of women being abducted and killed in the UK. Dame Cressida Dick, the head of the Metropolitan Police, made that point when addressing the UK nearly a week ago, saying that it is thankfully incredibly rare for a woman to be abducted from our streets. But that all depends on what you mean by rarity. If you compare it to the rate at which a man kills a woman in a domestic setting once every 3 days, according to the UK femicide census, then yes, perhaps it is rare. But rarity is besides the point. In 2021, rare should be never." Now, I think if you don't know anything about crime, and you don't know anything about crime statistics, and you don't know anything about criminal psychology, then you might read that and think it makes sense. And you might say, you know what, a woman should never ever be killed on the streets or whatever. And yeah, that makes sense. You could also say there should not be war. There should never be abortions. People shouldn't tell lies and naive statements like that, right? The fact is, crime is a reality. And to put this into perspective, so I think, first of all, I agree with Dame Cressida Dick that the abduction of women is quite rare. It's not something that happens every day. And you've got to bear in mind, you're talking about a population of 70 million people, right? The greater the population, the greater the chance you might have one person coming to grief in a certain way. It just stands to reason. But I want to put this into perspective. So if you look at the stat that is quoted there of a man kills a woman in a domestic setting once every 3 days in the UK, right? Well, in South Africa, 7 women die or murdered a day by men. 7 women are murdered per day, right? And you might say, wow, that's really, and bear in mind, South Africa's population is about 2/3 that of the UK. So you would expect it to be a much lower amount given that. But then there's another aspect to it. And the other aspect is, if you look at the percentage of female victims as a percentage of total victims, this is again in South Africa, it is 14%. So if you are complaining, arguing, criticizing, upset about the number of female victims, and this is in South Africa, where it's 7 per day, 7 every single day. Well, there are something like, I think it's 43 or 49 male victims every single day. That is male victims killed by other males, right? So actually the amount of women killed is actually proportionately a lot less. And if you look at it within that perspective, then suddenly the whole idea of there being rare or never incidents of crime just is very naive and it's very unrealistic. So to come back to the whole pandemic thing, you have a situation where you're saying we want to protect the lives of women, we want to protect the lives of other women or whatever, and then you gather in the name of Sarah Everard who's died, and then within a pandemic situation, and then this leads to possibly other women being infected and dying of corona. And it might not be the people at the vigil, It might be their grandmothers or their mothers or something like that. And I can tell you, I have a cousin who died earlier this year of coronavirus, and she died because she went to a funeral. And it's the same principle, really. It's the illogic, the sense of, you apparently want to preserve life, right? And you want to honor someone's life, and then by doing that, you're actually endangering not only your own life, but the lives of other people. It's nonsensical. And so I personally support those more than half people supporting what the Met Police did, although I'm not sure that their methods necessarily were acceptable. Their intervention was acceptable, the way that they intervened perhaps not so much. And so you do have a very difficult situation right now, which is when things that are unacceptable happen. Unfortunately, yes, you do need to express yourself in a way that is different to how we did in the past. So not coming together in crowds. One can express oneself in social media. You can write blogs. You can make a video of yourself. You can make lots of recordings that amount to the same thing of one big group of people gathering, right? Now, while I think it's true to say that I don't think a protest is something that reflects, it's not a tribute to Sarah anymore, which is what Elena Edwards said, and it's something that's become hijacked. I do think one's got to also be sensitive to the fact that Sarah Everard's death has become symbolic of frustration with authorities, frustration with the situation people are in, and while it might not be appropriate, while it might not be a logical symbolism, I think it nevertheless is something that is resonating with people, the sense of things aren't fair, what's going on isn't fair, the way the authorities are treating us isn't fair. But I do think it's a true two-way street. I think in the same way that we feel we deserve to trust the authorities, I think the authorities also need to feel that they can trust us. In other words, in terms of dealing with this pandemic, it is something that can become out of control, and it has become out of control certainly in some countries. And in those countries where it's gone out of control, it's literally been a case where people refuse to be told what to do, and that is a dangerous situation for law enforcement. On my Patreon channel, I've been recording weekly episodes of The Ripper, and today I recorded another one. And I've got to tell you, it's incredibly draining. It takes a lot out of me physically, mentally, spiritually. And today, the episodes that I dealt with Maureen Long, who actually survived her assault, and then also Jean Jordan. And what is just so frustrating is how close bystanders come to actually apprehending him. In the Maureen Long case, you have a situation where a night watchman actually sees the vehicle driving off and his dog barks, and unfortunately, even though Maureen has survived the attack, 5 hours go by before someone else hears a sound of whimpering. And unfortunately, Maureen can't remember the attack and actually gives the wrong, she remembers incorrectly that her attacker had blonde hair, right? And then in Jean Jordan's case, her common law husband, because Jean Jordan doesn't really tell people where she goes, her common law husband assumed that she'd gone to Scotland, and so her crime wasn't mentioned in the press. And you also had the situation there where it's just so tantalizing, it's so close, the public parking their cars right where this perpetrator is committing the crime, and eventually scaring him off to the extent that he had to come back later. But you just wish that if only society could open their eyes and look around and just be a little bit more alert, then you could catch these killers. And killers and criminals do rely on complacency. And if only the society could act as the eyes to some extent of law enforcement, not leave everything to law enforcement, but be a kind of extension of that they could also be vigilant, that they could also take note of what is going on them. It would make for a much safer society. And by the way, that is the assessment from South Africa's Institute for Security Studies, is the way to solve. In South Africa, it's really rampant. Crime is really rampant. But their suggestion for a solution is not to expect the police to do everything. It's to have a community that is alert, that is conscious, that is communicating, that is engaging with the police, and there's a two-way street, right? And so that is really what you need for a healthy society and a safe society, is where the police and community take hands, not where they're at war with one another, or battling one another, or facing off with one another. Someone on Patreon also sent me a selection of pictures from Sandwich, and as well as this description. She said, the pics I took were taken just up the road from my daughter's school, so we see the activity in that particular area every day. The area is that of a riverside walk, which saw quite a bit of activity, but you cannot see much or get close enough to get any better pictures. There's always a policeman on guard, and you cannot walk down the riverside as the children usually would do going to and from school. Fortuitously, I had to stop at the zebra crossing this morning to let the kids cross, so I wound down my window and spoke to the guy that was on duty on the taped off area. I said, I bet you are chilly standing there, and I said, have you had much luck finding anything helpful? And he smiled and he said he couldn't comment. I didn't expect him to be honest, but it was worth a try. At least he was friendly. She goes on to say, there's a lot going on in other areas of Sandwich, which for reference is an upmarket but fairly small town. The co-op car park seemed of particular interest, and today they are searching a couple of new areas of land which are adjacent. I would love to know the relevance of these areas, considering Sarah's remains were found in Ashford, about 30 miles from Sandwich, although it is of course next to Deal, where cousins lived, so perhaps that's why. Are they thinking he dumped some items in the river? I think that is what they are thinking. I think they are assuming he threw her phone in the river. She goes on to say, I know her phone was not found. I know her remains were identified by dental records. So does that mean other parts of her are possibly elsewhere? I think that is possible. We don't know how much of her remains were found. I think if there was something like dismemberment, that would have been mentioned, but I'm not 100% sure. It's difficult to say. She goes on to say, do you think they are acting on information he has given up, or just following procedure? I think it's a combination. I think he has given them some information. What would be interesting is whether he had his phone on him and whether they were able to track his movements based on his phone. It's also possible there was someone assisting him, and so it could be that person's phone as well. I do think part of it is also just following procedure, and I think it is important for the police to be absolutely thorough in their work, because everyone is really watching this case. So I think they're trying to dot every I and cross every T in this particular case. She goes on to say, I would also be interested to know if he killed her in London, or did he bring her home alive and then kill her. I don't think that he did kill her in London, but it does raise the question of how would he transport her if she was alive, right? And I think that then does raise the possibility of an accomplice. You could also say that he could have put her in the trunk of the car. It's also possible that he simply just had a gun on her, something like that. It's really difficult to say. Something else that he could have done is handcuffed her and then handcuffed her to some part inside the vehicle. We do have a case that provides some intertextuality to this idea, this notion, and it is the Heidi Broussard case. And but what kind of makes a bit more sense in that case is the fact that Heidi Broussard was a friend of her murderer, in this case, Megan Fieramusca. I think the other question that is raised, and I've mentioned it before, is where would he have brought her to if she was alive? Would he have brought her home, which raises all sorts of problems and issues? Or would he have brought her to that garage, the abandoned garage of his family? And I think that is more likely. Then she also goes on, this is the patron on Patreon, saying, I wonder if we will ever know the details, or will we have to wait until his trial? I think we are going to need to wait until the trial. She says, I think after we were given so much info from the Watts case, it always seems so frustrating not to have so much in subsequent cases. Or maybe that's just me. No, it's absolutely true. In the Watts case, we got almost overwhelmed with information, and not just information, but also body cam. And I don't know if it's something that is as frequently used and as frequently publicized in the UK as it is in America. I mean, do bobbies generally get bobby cams, or should we call it body cams, as part of their outfit, as part of their gear? So I just want to encourage my viewers, my supporters, my readers who are following my analysis of this case to keep your support of Sarah Everard within the boundary of, we want to know what happened to her, and not sort of conflate it with distrust of law enforcement or activism or protest. There may be certain things that aren't perfect with law enforcement, but law enforcement are sort of up to their gills in trying to, do other things, such as contain this pandemic. And so I think they need to be cut a little bit of slack. And I also think that people need to try to be a little bit more tolerant and a little bit more flexible in this time of all times. We are living in unusual times. There is a part of me that supports a lot of interest in something like what happened to Sarah Everard, just because sometimes there's a sort of apathy in terms of crime, and it is sometimes very important that the media and the public really get on board and find out what is going on in our society. But you can have a situation where that coverage is skewed in the wrong direction, and what you end up learning is counterproductive. A good example of that is all the coverage into Madeleine McCann. If you really care about missing children, I don't know whether the Madeleine McCann case has done much of a service to that. And I know that might be anathema to some people, but if you think about it, it's an unsolved case. So much attention goes on to that case. So much resources has gone into that case. Has that been good? Has that been good from a law enforcement perspective, and has it been good from a perspective of the victims? What do you think? And so I'm just saying we've got to be careful of that, something like that happening for the wrong reasons in the Sarah Everard case. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.